Picture this: the most feared dictator in modern history, making crucial decisions that would affect millions of lives, while under the influence of a cocktail of dangerous substances. What you're about to discover will fundamentally change how you understand the final years of World War II and the collapse of the Nazi regime. For decades, historians have debated the erratic behavior of Adolf Hitler during the war's final phase. The trembling hands, the wild mood swings, the increasingly irrational military decisions that defied all strategic logic. Today, we know the truth behind these behaviors lies in a dark dependency that consumed the Führer and potentially altered the course of history itself. This isn't speculation or conspiracy theory. This is documented medical history, backed by the testimonies of those who witnessed it firsthand, including Hitler's own personal physician. What emerges is a portrait of a man whose grip on reality became increasingly tenuous as his dependency deepened. But the story goes far deeper than one man's addiction. It reveals how an entire regime became dependent on chemical enhancement, from the highest levels of leadership down to the front lines. The implications of what you're about to learn extend far beyond individual choices. They touch the very foundations of how wars are fought and how power corrupts absolutely. Dr. Theodor Morell first met Adolf Hitler in 1936, introduced by Heinrich Hoffmann, Hitler's personal photographer. At that time, Morell was known in Berlin's elite circles as a physician who specialized in unconventional treatments and vitamin injections. What began as treatment for Hitler's chronic stomach problems would evolve into something far more sinister. Morell's initial treatments seemed beneficial. Hitler's digestive issues improved, and his energy levels appeared to stabilize. The dictator was so pleased with these results that he appointed Morell as his personal physician, a position that would grant the doctor unprecedented access to one of the most powerful men in the world. The relationship between doctor and patient quickly became one of complete dependency. Hitler trusted Morell implicitly, often referring to him as his miracle doctor. This trust would prove to be catastrophic, not just for Hitler personally, but for the millions who would suffer under his increasingly erratic leadership. Morell began documenting every treatment he administered, keeping detailed medical records that would later provide historians with an unprecedented window into Hitler's declining health and growing substance dependency. These records, discovered after the war, paint a disturbing picture of a physician who seemed more interested in maintaining his patient's dependency than in providing genuine medical care. The early treatments included various vitamins, glucose injections, and hormone preparations. Hitler became convinced that these injections were essential to his health and performance. He began demanding them with increasing frequency, setting the stage for what would become a dangerous escalation in both the potency and frequency of his treatments. What makes this period particularly chilling is how normal it all seemed at the time. Hitler's inner circle viewed Morell's treatments as simply medical care for a hard-working leader. None of them could have anticipated how these seemingly innocent vitamin injections would eventually evolve into something far darker. But Morell's ambitions extended beyond simple medical care. He began experimenting with new treatments, always promising Hitler enhanced energy and improved performance. Each success made Hitler more dependent, more trusting, and more willing to accept increasingly powerful substances. The stage was being set for a medical relationship that would spiral completely out of control, with consequences that would reverberate across the globe. What started as stomach medicine would soon become something that historians now recognize as one of the most significant factors in the Nazi regime's final chaotic years. By 1941, Morell's treatments had evolved significantly from the simple vitamin injections of the early years. He began introducing more potent substances, claiming they were necessary to maintain Hitler's energy levels during the increasingly demanding war effort. The Führer's daily routine now included multiple injections, each one making him more dependent on chemical enhancement. The first major escalation came with the introduction of methamphetamine-based preparations. Morell disguised these powerful stimulants as energy boosters, claiming they were necessary for Hitler to maintain his superhuman work schedule. Hitler, who often worked late into the night and demanded peak performance from himself, readily accepted these explanations. Those closest to Hitler began noticing changes in his behavior and appearance. His longtime secretary, Traudl Junge, later described how the Führer's eyes took on a different quality, more intense, more restless. His hands, which had previously been steady, began to develop a subtle tremor that would worsen over time. Hitler's eating habits became increasingly erratic, He would go long periods without food, sustained only by Morell's injections, then suddenly demand large meals at odd hours. His sleep patterns became chaotic, with periods of intense wakefulness followed by crashes that could last for days. The military implications of these changes began to manifest in Hitler's strategic decisions. Previously, despite his many flaws as a strategist, Hitler had maintained a certain logical consistency in his military thinking. Now his decisions became increasingly impulsive and contradictory. Staff meetings that had once followed predictable patterns now became unpredictable affairs. Hitler might arrive full of manic energy, speaking rapidly and jumping from topic to topic, or he might appear sluggish and distracted, unable to focus on crucial military briefings. His generals began to adapt their presentation styles to account for their leader's unpredictable mental state. The frequency of injections increased dramatically during this period. What had started as weekly treatments became daily occurrences, then multiple times per day. Morell maintained detailed records of each injection, noting Hitler's responses and adjusting dosages accordingly. Perhaps most disturbing was how Hitler's inner circle normalized these changes. They attributed his erratic behavior to the stress of war, never questioning whether the constant medical interventions might be contributing to his declining mental state. This willful blindness would prove catastrophic as the war progressed. The chemical dependency was becoming deeply embedded in Hitler's daily routine, affecting not just his personal health but his ability to lead a nation at war. Yet the worst was still to come, as Morell prepared to introduce even more powerful substances into his patient's regimen. The invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941 marked a turning point not just in the war, but in Hitler's substance dependency. The enormous stress of managing a two-front war, combined with his growing reliance on chemical enhancement, created a perfect storm of escalating drug use. Morell responded to Hitler's increased stress by dramatically intensifying his treatment regimen. The injections now included more powerful stimulants, pain medications, and experimental combinations that Morell claimed would enhance Hitler's cognitive abilities and physical endurance. The Führer willingly accepted these escalations, convinced that his enhanced performance was essential to Germany's war effort. Hitler's behavior during crucial military conferences became increasingly unpredictable. General Franz Halder, chief of the German General Staff, documented instances where Hitler would become fixated on minor details while ignoring major strategic concerns. During one critical planning session for the Moscow offensive, Hitler spent over an hour obsessing about uniform regulations while dismissing his general's concerns about winter supply lines. The tremor in Hitler's hands, first noticed in 1941, became more pronounced. He began using his right hand to steady his left during public appearances, a technique that would become increasingly common as the war progressed. Photographs from this period show a marked change in his physical appearance. The confident posture of earlier years replaced by a more hunched, tense bearing. Sleep deprivation became chronic. Hitler's natural tendency toward late-night work sessions, amplified by stimulant use, created a cycle where he would remain awake for up to 20 hours, then crash completely. During these crash periods, he became virtually unreachable, leaving crucial military decisions in limbo for days at a time. The impact on military operations was profound. The German army's advance toward Moscow stalled not just due to winter weather and extended supply lines, but also due to contradictory orders emanating from a leadership that had become chemically compromised. Hitler's decision to halt the advance on Moscow and redirect forces to Leningrad and Ukraine puzzled his generals and may have cost Germany its best chance of victory in the East. Morell's records from this period show an alarming escalation in both the frequency and potency of treatments. Hitler was now receiving multiple injections daily, including powerful painkillers that Morell claimed were necessary for the Führer's chronic stomach problems. The line between medical treatment and substance abuse had become completely blurred. Those in Hitler's inner circle who might have questioned these treatments found themselves increasingly excluded from his presence. Heinrich Himmler and Hermann Göring, both suspicious of Morell's influence, were gradually pushed to the periphery of Hitler's daily routine. Only those who accepted and enabled his dependency maintained close access. The Russian winter of 1941–42 would prove to be more than just a military disaster. It would mark the beginning of a complete psychological and physical breakdown that would define the remainder of the war. By 1943, Hitler's dependency had reached levels that would have been immediately recognizable as substance abuse by any modern medical standard. Morell's treatment regimen now included a daily cocktail of methamphetamines, opiates, steroids, and experimental drugs that he obtained through his connections in the German pharmaceutical industry. The physical deterioration became impossible to hide from those who saw Hitler regularly. His valet, Heinz Linge, later described how the Führer's hands shook so severely that he could barely hold papers steady enough to read them. During important meetings, Hitler would clasp his hands behind his back or sit on them to conceal the tremors. Hitler's famous rages, once calculated displays of political theater, became genuinely uncontrolled episodes. Staff members learned to recognize the signs of an impending outburst: the rapid speech, the dilated pupils, the inability to remain still. These episodes would leave Hitler exhausted for hours afterward, requiring additional treatments to restore his energy. The decision-making process at the highest levels of Nazi leadership became increasingly chaotic. Hitler would make sweeping military decisions during brief periods of chemically induced confidence, then become incapable of sustained strategic thinking for days afterward. The famous Atlantic Wall fortifications, the deployment of V-weapons, and the allocation of resources to various fronts all reflected this erratic decision-making pattern. Morell began introducing experimental treatments obtained from concentration camp medical experiments. The doctor's moral boundaries had completely dissolved as he sought new ways to maintain his patient's dependency while managing the increasingly severe side effects of long-term stimulant abuse. Hitler's paranoia, always a significant aspect of his personality, became pathological during this period. He began to suspect even his most loyal followers of betrayal, leading to purges and reorganizations that further weakened Nazi leadership effectiveness. This paranoia was chemically amplified, making rational assessment of loyalty impossible. The impact on Germany's war effort was catastrophic. Resources that should have been allocated based on strategic necessity were instead distributed according to Hitler's chemically influenced whims. The famous order to hold ground at all costs, regardless of military logic, reflected the rigid thinking patterns common in long-term stimulant users. Sleep patterns became completely disrupted. Hitler would remain awake for days at a time, sustained by injections, making crucial decisions while in states of severe sleep deprivation. When he finally crashed, he would be unreachable for extended periods, leaving the entire Nazi war machine without clear direction. Morell's records indicate that Hitler was now receiving injections every few hours around the clock. The doctor had essentially become a dealer, managing his patient's addiction while pretending to provide medical care. The distinction between treatment and enabling had been completely erased. What emerged was a leadership structure dependent not on rational analysis or strategic thinking, but on the chemical cycles of one man's addiction. The implications for military planning, resource allocation, and strategic decision-making were profound and ultimately decisive in determining the war's outcome. The final phase of Hitler's life, spent largely in the underground bunker complex beneath Berlin, represents the ultimate degradation of a leader consumed by chemical dependency. By 1944, Morell's treatments had created a man who bore little resemblance to the confident dictator who had risen to power a decade earlier. Hitler's daily routine had become entirely structured around his injection schedule. He would wake in the afternoon, receive his first series of injections, conduct brief meetings during periods of artificial energy, then require additional treatments to maintain even basic functionality. His natural sleep cycle had been completely destroyed by years of stimulant abuse. The tremor in his left hand had become so severe that he could no longer write legibly for extended periods. His signature, once bold and decisive, became shaky and inconsistent. During the final months, he often required assistants to sign important documents, a fact carefully concealed from all but his most trusted staff. Hitler's mental state during this period reflected the classic symptoms of long-term methamphetamine abuse. His thinking became increasingly rigid and paranoid. He would fixate on minor details while ignoring major strategic realities. The famous order to destroy German infrastructure as Allied forces approached, the so-called Nero Decree, exemplified this chemically compromised decision-making. Morell had essentially become Hitler's most important advisor, not through political acumen, but through his control of the Führer's chemical dependency. Other Nazi leaders found themselves competing not with rival ideologies or strategies, but with a doctor who could determine their leader's mood and energy levels through pharmaceutical manipulation. The bunker's atmosphere became increasingly surreal as Hitler's condition deteriorated. Staff members learned to time important requests and briefings to coincide with his periods of chemical enhancement. Military planning sessions were scheduled around injection schedules rather than strategic necessities. Hitler's famous final birthday celebration on April 20th, 1945, provides a stark illustration of his condition. Footage from that day shows a man whose hands shake uncontrollably, whose posture is stooped and fragile, and whose eyes reflect the hollow intensity of severe substance abuse. The confident orator of the 1930s had been replaced by a chemically dependent shadow. The decision to remain in Berlin rather than retreat to more defensible positions reflected the impaired judgment of a leader whose capacity for rational strategic thinking had been completely compromised. Hitler's refusal to consider evacuation or negotiation wasn't just stubborn pride. It was the rigid, unrealistic thinking characteristic of long-term stimulant abuse. Morel himself began to recognize the hopelessness of the situation. His records from the final weeks show a man who had lost control of his patient's condition. The treatments that had once provided temporary enhancement now barely maintained basic functionality. In the bunker's final days, Hitler's dependency reached its logical conclusion. The man who had once commanded armies across Europe could barely function without constant chemical support. The injections continued almost until the very end, a futile attempt to maintain the illusion of leadership in a regime that had already collapsed from within. The impact of Hitler's chemical dependency on military operations extended far beyond his personal deterioration. The Nazi war machine, built on the principle of absolute obedience to the Führer's will, became increasingly dysfunctional as that will became chemically compromised. Military historians have identified numerous critical decisions that bear the hallmarks of impaired judgment. The declaration of war on the United States following Pearl Harbor, made without consultation with his military advisors, reflected the impulsive decision-making common in stimulant users. The decision to fight a winter war in Russia without adequate preparation showed the same pattern of overconfidence followed by rigid refusal to adapt to reality. The development and deployment of Germany's Wonder Weapons program reflected Hitler's chemically enhanced grandiosity. Resources desperately needed for conventional weapons were diverted to experimental projects that promised miraculous battlefield advantages. The V-1 and V-2 rocket programs, while technologically impressive, consumed enormous resources that could have produced thousands of conventional aircraft or tanks. Hitler's micromanagement of military operations from his various headquarters locations became increasingly problematic as his condition deteriorated. Generals in the field found themselves receiving contradictory orders that reflected his changing mental state rather than battlefield realities. The famous "hold at all costs" orders that prevented tactical retreats and regrouping reflected the rigid thinking patterns associated with long-term stimulant abuse. The allocation of military resources during the war's final years followed no logical strategic pattern. Instead, decisions reflected Hitler's chemically influenced fixations and paranoid suspicions. Elite units were deployed based on his personal whims rather than military necessity. The SS Panzer divisions, Germany's most effective mobile reserves, were often committed to battles that served Hitler's psychological needs rather than strategic objectives. Intelligence assessments were increasingly ignored or distorted to conform to Hitler's chemically enhanced delusions of invincibility. Reports of Allied strength and capabilities were dismissed if they contradicted his optimistic projections. This denial of reality, amplified by his substance dependency, prevented effective strategic planning during critical periods. The command structure itself began to reflect Hitler's paranoid thinking. Competent generals who questioned his decisions were dismissed or reassigned, replaced by officers whose primary qualification was their willingness to enable his increasingly erratic leadership. This created a command climate where honest assessment became impossible. The impact on troop morale was profound. Soldiers in the field began to recognize that orders from higher headquarters often made no military sense. The Wehrmacht's legendary discipline and effectiveness gradually eroded as the disconnection between leadership and battlefield reality became apparent. German industrial production during the war's later years reflected the same pattern of chemically influenced decision-making. Resources were allocated to projects that captured Hitler's imagination, rather than meeting actual military needs. The result was a patchwork of partially completed programs that consumed enormous resources without delivering battlefield effectiveness. Perhaps most tragically, the prolongation of the war itself may have reflected Hitler's impaired capacity for rational decision-making. A leader operating with clear judgment might have sought negotiated peace as Germany's position became hopeless. Instead, the rigid thinking patterns associated with his dependency prevented any realistic assessment of the military situation. Hitler's substance abuse did not exist in isolation. It was part of a broader culture of chemical enhancement that permeated Nazi leadership and German society during the war years. The normalization of drug use at the highest levels of government created a cascade of dysfunction that extended throughout the regime. Hermann Göring, head of the Luftwaffe, developed his own severe dependency on morphine following a World War I injury. His addiction, managed through legitimate medical channels, paralleled Hitler's situation in many ways. Göring's erratic behavior and increasingly poor strategic decisions for the German Air Force reflected his own chemical impairment. The German military itself became heavily dependent on methamphetamines distributed to combat troops. The drug, marketed under the brand name Pervitin, was issued to soldiers to enhance alertness and reduce fatigue during extended operations. What began as tactical enhancement evolved into widespread dependency among frontline units. Heinrich Himmler, despite his public advocacy for physical purity and health, regularly received injections from his own personal physician. While less well documented than Hitler's treatments, evidence suggests that Himmler's increasingly paranoid and erratic behavior during the war's final years may have had chemical components. The culture of enhancement created a leadership structure where rational decision-making became increasingly difficult. Important meetings were conducted by officials operating under various chemical influences, making coordinated policy development nearly impossible. The result was a fragmented approach to governance that reflected individual chemical states rather than coherent strategy. German pharmaceutical companies, eager to maintain government contracts, developed increasingly potent formulations for military and civilian use. The line between medical treatment and chemical enhancement became completely blurred as doctors competed to provide the most effective performance-enhancing treatments. The impact on Nazi ideology itself was profound. The regime's emphasis on racial purity and physical superiority became increasingly hypocritical as its leadership became dependent on artificial chemical enhancement. This contradiction was carefully concealed from the German public, but it undermined the moral authority of Nazi leaders among those who knew the truth. Medical ethics within the Nazi system collapsed completely as physicians became enablers rather than healers. The Hippocratic Oath's prohibition against causing harm was abandoned in favor of maintaining the chemical dependencies of powerful patients. This moral breakdown extended to the horrific medical experiments conducted in concentration camps. The economic implications were staggering. Resources that should have been allocated to military production were instead consumed by an elaborate system of pharmaceutical development and distribution designed to maintain the leadership's chemical dependencies. The opportunity cost of this misallocation may have been decisive in determining the war's outcome. Intelligence agencies of allied nations began to recognize patterns in German decision-making that suggested chemical impairment at high levels. While they could not have known the specific details of Hitler's treatment regimen, they observed the increasingly erratic and self-destructive nature of Nazi policies. The normalization of chemical dependency at the highest levels of Nazi leadership created a feedback loop where increasingly poor decisions led to greater stress, which led to increased substance use, which led to even poorer decisions. This cycle accelerated during the war's final years, contributing to the regime's rapid collapse. The discovery of Dr. Morell's detailed medical records after the war provided historians with unprecedented insight into Hitler's daily routine and chemical intake. These documents, found in various archives and private collections, paint a disturbing picture of a patient whose treatment had evolved far beyond any recognizable medical standard. Morell's records show that by 1944, Hitler was receiving injections containing methamphetamines, opiates, steroids, vitamins, and experimental compounds up to 8 times per day. The doctor meticulously recorded each treatment, noting Hitler's responses and adjusting dosages based on his patient's demands rather than medical necessity. These records represent one of the most complete documentation of high-level political addiction in modern history. The progression of treatments reveals a classic pattern of addiction and tolerance. Early records from 1936 show modest doses of relatively mild stimulants, glucose injections combined with vitamins that would be considered routine by medical standards of the time. However, by 1940, the records show the introduction of stronger compounds. Pervitin, the German military's methamphetamine preparation, began appearing in Hitler's treatment logs with increasing frequency. Medical experts who have reviewed Morell's records have identified treatments that would be considered dangerous by any contemporary standard. The combination of stimulants and depressants, administered simultaneously, created chemical conflicts within Hitler's system that could have proven fatal at any time. Dr. Werner Hasse, Hitler's backup physician, who occasionally reviewed these treatments, expressed private concern about the dangerous drug interaction, but was consistently overruled by Hitler's personal preference for Morell's more aggressive approach. The records reveal the introduction of increasingly exotic compounds as Hitler's tolerance grew. By 1942, Morell was administering preparations containing extracts from animal organs, including treatments derived from bull testicles that he claimed would enhance virility and energy. These bizarre treatments reflected both Morell's desperation to maintain effectiveness and his willingness to exploit Hitler's superstitions about physical enhancement. Hitler's own demands for enhanced performance drove much of the escalation. Morell's notes include detailed descriptions of the Führer's insistence on treatments that would allow him to work longer hours, think more clearly, and maintain his public image. During the preparation for major speeches or military conferences, Hitler would specifically request additional treatments, creating a pattern where his most important public appearances were delivered while under heavy chemical influence. The financial aspects of this treatment regimen were staggering. Morell's records show payments for experimental drugs and rare compounds that consumed enormous resources during a time when Germany was experiencing severe shortages. A single injection of his most potent preparations cost more than an average German worker's monthly salary. The Reich's limited pharmaceutical supplies were being diverted to maintain one man's addiction, while wounded soldiers went without adequate pain medication. Contemporary medical analysis of Morell's treatment protocols reveals the extent to which normal medical ethics had been abandoned. The doctor was essentially conducting uncontrolled human experimentation on his patient, using Hitler's political power to obtain substances that would never have been available through normal medical channels. Some of the compounds Morell used were obtained directly from concentration camp medical research programs, creating a horrifying connection between Hitler's personal addiction and the regime's systematic human experimentation. The psychological dependency revealed in these records is as significant as the physical addiction. Hitler had become convinced that his enhanced performance was essential to Germany's survival. This delusion created a feedback loop where any suggestion of reducing treatments was viewed as treason against the Reich. When Heinrich Himmler attempted to introduce an alternative physician in late 1944, Hitler's reaction was so violent that the suggestion was never raised again. Morell's personal notes reveal his own recognition of the situation's medical impossibility. By 1945, he was essentially managing a patient whose system had been so compromised by years of abuse that any attempt to reduce treatments risked complete physical collapse. His private diary entries, discovered decades after the war, describe his fear that Hitler might die during one of the treatment sessions, potentially making him responsible for the Reich's collapse. The records also document the elaborate rituals that developed around Hitler's treatments. Specific rooms in various headquarters were equipped with medical supplies. Morell traveled with a portable pharmacy containing dozens of different compounds. The daily schedule of the Third Reich's leadership was structured around Hitler's injection times, with important meetings delayed or rescheduled based on his chemical state. Perhaps most chilling is the documentation of how Hitler's addiction influenced his decision-making about medical care for others. His obsession with pharmaceutical enhancement led to the diversion of medical resources away from battlefield medicine toward experimental drug research. Entire pharmaceutical facilities were dedicated to producing compounds for his personal use, while German soldiers suffered from inadequate medical supplies. The records end abruptly in late April 1945, as Morell fled Berlin ahead of the advancing Soviet forces. His final entries describe a patient who had become completely dependent on chemical support for even basic cognitive functions. The last documented treatment occurred on April 22, 1945, just 8 days before Hitler's death. Even in the bunker's final hours, the addiction continued to drive both patient and physician toward a dependency that had consumed them both. The last months of Hitler's life represent the inevitable conclusion of years of systematic chemical abuse. By early 1945, the man who had once commanded the attention of millions could barely function without constant pharmaceutical support. The transformation from confident dictator to chemically dependent invalid was now complete, with profound implications for the war's final phase. Hitler's physical appearance during this period shocked even his most loyal followers. Albert Speer, his former architect and armaments minister, described encountering a man who seemed to have aged decades in just a few years. The tremor in his left hand had become so severe that he walked with a pronounced stoop, keeping the affected hand pressed against his body or hidden behind his back. His once piercing blue eyes had become rheumy and unfocused, reflecting the toll of years of chemical abuse. The bunker beneath Berlin became a surreal environment where military briefings were scheduled around injection times, and crucial decisions were made by a leader whose mental state fluctuated wildly based on his chemical intake. Staff members learned to recognize the signs of his various states and adjust their interactions accordingly. During periods immediately following injections, Hitler might display bursts of manic energy, speaking rapidly about grandiose plans for victory. Hours later, he would crash into periods of stupor where he could barely acknowledge the presence of others. Morell's final treatments became increasingly desperate attempts to maintain even basic functionality. The doctor's records from this period show a man who had lost all pretense of medical legitimacy, simply trying to keep his patient conscious and marginally coherent. The treatments that had once provided hours of enhanced energy now offered only brief periods of artificial alertness. Morell began combining multiple stimulants in dangerous cocktails, knowing that the risk of cardiac arrest was high, but faced with a patient who demanded continued enhancement despite his deteriorating condition. The bizarre nature of these final treatments reflected both Morell's desperation and his complete abandonment of medical ethics. He administered experimental compounds developed from concentration camp research, including preparations derived from prisoners' blood and hormones extracted from executed victims. These horrifying treatments represented the ultimate intersection of Nazi medical experimentation and Hitler's personal addiction. Hitler's decision-making during the final weeks reflected the complete breakdown of his cognitive abilities. His orders to destroy German infrastructure through the Nero Decree showed the vindictive, punitive thinking common in severe addiction cases. His refusal to consider evacuation from Berlin, despite the obvious military hopelessness, demonstrated the rigid, unrealistic thinking patterns that characterize long-term stimulant abuse. Most tellingly, his increasingly disconnected view of military realities, including his belief that phantom armies would somehow materialize to save Berlin, bore all the hallmarks of chemically induced paranoid delusions. The famous scene of Hitler reviewing boy soldiers in the bunker's courtyard, filmed just days before his death, provides visual evidence of his condition that no amount of propaganda could conceal. His movements are uncertain and shuffling. His hands shake uncontrollably, even when he attempts to steady them, and his eyes reflect the hollow intensity of severe substance abuse. This was no longer the confident leader of earlier years, but a chemically dependent shadow attempting to perform the role of Führer while barely maintaining consciousness. The interaction with these child soldiers reveals another disturbing aspect of Hitler's final condition: his inability to focus on their faces, his disconnected responses to their presence, and his mechanical gestures of affection all reflected the emotional numbing common in advanced addiction cases. The man who had once inspired millions could barely connect with the children standing before him. Morell himself began to break down under the pressure of maintaining his patient's impossible treatment regimen. The doctor's own health deteriorated as he struggled to manage Hitler's addiction while dealing with the chaos of Berlin's final siege. By April 1945, Morell was essentially a fellow prisoner of the addiction he had created, unable to leave his patient, but also unable to provide treatments that would genuinely help him. The impact on those around Hitler was profound and psychologically devastating. His closest associates watched helplessly as their leader disintegrated before their eyes, unable to confront the reality of his condition, because doing so would have required acknowledging their own complicity in enabling his addiction. Some, like Heinrich Himmler, began making independent contact with Allied forces, recognizing that Hitler was no longer capable of rational leadership. Others, like Joseph Goebbels, seemed to find a perverse comfort in sharing Hitler's chemically induced delusions. The bunker's atmosphere during these final weeks became increasingly apocalyptic. Staff members described an environment where normal human interaction had become impossible because all relationships were mediated through Hitler's chemical cycles. Important military decisions were delayed for hours while waiting for Hitler to become coherent enough to provide direction. When he did emerge from his quarters, his instructions were often so disconnected from reality that subordinates had to interpret them rather than implement them directly. Hitler's final public appearances were carefully choreographed to conceal his condition, but even these revealed the extent of his deterioration. His voice, once powerful and commanding, had become weak and uncertain. His famous gestures were reduced to subtle movements designed to hide his tremors. The recording equipment had to be adjusted to capture his weakened voice, and multiple takes were often necessary because his speech would become slurred or incoherent mid-sentence. The decision-making process for Germany's final military operations reflected Hitler's complete cognitive impairment. Orders to units that no longer existed, plans for counterattacks with non-existent forces, and strategic directives that contradicted basic military reality all flowed from a bunker where the Supreme Commander was operating in a chemically induced alternate reality. German generals in the field began ignoring orders from Berlin, recognizing that they came from a source that had lost all contact with military reality. Perhaps most tragically, Hitler's final weeks were marked by moments of lucidity, where he seemed to recognize the extent of his dependency and degradation. Staff members described brief periods where he would look around the bunker with something approaching awareness, as if seeing his surroundings clearly for the first time in months. These moments of clarity seemed to terrify him more than his periods of chemical confusion, suggesting that maintaining his addiction had become preferable to facing the reality of his condition. The decision to end his life may have been influenced by his recognition of his complete dependency and the impossibility of maintaining his condition without Morell's treatments. When Morell was finally dismissed in the bunker's final days, Hitler's last act of independence from his addiction, he may have realized that continuing to live would mean facing withdrawal symptoms that his compromised system could not survive. In the bunker's final hours, as Soviet forces closed in on the underground complex, Hitler made his last requests for chemical enhancement. Even facing imminent death, the addiction continued to drive his behavior. Staff members described him asking for treatments that could help him think clearly for his final decisions, unaware that the treatments themselves had been preventing clear thinking for years. The man who had once believed himself destined for greatness had become a prisoner of his own chemical needs, unable to face reality without artificial enhancement, yet unable to function effectively even with it. The Third Reich's leader spent his final conscious moments seeking the chemical escape that had defined his later years, a fitting end to a regime that had consistently chosen artificial solutions over confronting difficult realities. When Soviet forces finally breached the bunker complex, they found evidence of the elaborate medical setup that had sustained Hitler's addiction: syringes, vials of various compounds, and medical equipment that seemed more appropriate for a hospital than a military command center. These physical remnants provided silent testimony to how completely the pursuit of chemical enhancement had consumed the Nazi leadership's final years. The story of Hitler's chemical dependency represents one of history's most chilling examples of how substance abuse can compromise leadership at the highest levels with global consequences. What began as seemingly legitimate medical treatment evolved into a full-scale addiction that affected military strategy, resource allocation, and the duration of World War II itself. The implications extend far beyond one man's personal struggle with addiction. Hitler's dependency created a leadership vacuum at the center of Nazi power that contributed to the regime's increasingly erratic and self-destructive behavior. Military decisions that might have been made rationally were instead driven by the chemical cycles of an addicted leader. The role of Dr. Theodor Morell in enabling and escalating this dependency raises profound questions about medical ethics and the responsibilities of physicians to their patients and to society. Morell's transformation from doctor to enabler illustrates how professional boundaries can collapse when power dynamics become severely distorted. Perhaps most significantly, this history demonstrates how individual pathology can influence world events when that individual holds absolute power. Hitler's chemical dependency didn't just affect his personal health, it affected the lives of millions of people across Europe and around the world. The normalization of chemical enhancement throughout Nazi leadership created a culture where rational decision-making became increasingly impossible. This breakdown of leadership capacity may have been a decisive factor in the war's outcome, potentially shortening the conflict by undermining German strategic effectiveness. The medical records and testimonies that document this dependency provide a unique window into the intersection of personal pathology and historical events. They reveal how private struggles with addiction can have public consequences of unprecedented magnitude when the addicted individual possesses unlimited political power. This history also serves as a warning about the dangers of unchecked power and the importance of institutional constraints on leadership. Hitler's ability to surround himself with enablers while excluding those who might have challenged his dependency illustrates how authoritarian systems can facilitate rather than prevent individual pathology. The story of Hitler's final years reminds us that behind the grand narratives of political ideology and military strategy lie individual human stories of weakness, dependency, and moral collapse. Understanding these personal dimensions of historical events helps us better comprehend how extraordinary circumstances can emerge from seemingly ordinary human failings. The chemical dependency that defined Hitler's later years serves as a powerful reminder that leaders, despite their public personas and political power, remain vulnerable to the same personal struggles that affect ordinary individuals. The difference lies in the scale of consequences when those struggles go unchecked and unchallenged. This examination of Hitler's dependency provides crucial insight into one of history's darkest periods, while serving as a cautionary tale about the intersection of power, addiction, and the human capacity for both individual and collective destruction. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.